Rome was not built by emperors. That is the truth that history books rarely highlight, and it will completely change the way you see the greatest empire the world has ever known. While everyone talks about the Caesars, the Colosseum, and the flowing togas, there is a much deeper, far more brutal and fascinating layer to this story. The men who truly held Rome together with blood, strategy, and an ambition that no rulebook could contain. Generals who didn't just win battles, they reshaped the world. Have you ever stopped to think about why Rome lasted so long? Why an empire managed to dominate everything from North Africa to the British Isles for centuries, while entire civilizations disappeared around it? The answer is not in the speeches of the Senate or in the celebrations of emperors. It lies in decisions made hundreds of miles from Rome, on muddy battlefields, by men who had to choose between glory and death in a matter of seconds. Men who often saved Rome, and whom Rome in return sometimes destroyed. In this video, you will meet 5 of the most feared generals Rome ever produced. These are not just stories of war, they are lessons in leadership, strategy, and power that still apply today. Each of these men left a mark so deep that the world still feels the consequences of the decisions they made more than 2,000 years ago. And by the end of this video, you will understand Rome in a way that most people never will. Get ready, because this story begins now. Few names in Roman military history carry as much weight as Scipio Africanus. While Hannibal Barca was devastating Italy with his war elephants and brilliant tactics, Rome was bleeding and the panic was real. It was in this moment of desperation that Scipio emerged with an idea that seemed almost insane for the time. Instead of continuing to try to push Hannibal out of Italy, he proposed attacking Carthage directly, forcing the Carthaginian general to return and defend his own homeland. It was a bold, calculated move and devastatingly effective. The battle that sealed the fate of this rivalry was the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, and it is still studied today in the world's leading military academies. Scipio knew that the war elephants were Hannibal's greatest weapon, so he did something simple and brilliant. He opened corridors within the Roman battle lines, allowing the animals to pass through without causing destruction, turning the enemy's greatest advantage into something useless. It's the kind of strategy that teaches a timeless lesson. When you truly understand your opponent's greatest strength, you can turn it into a weakness. Scipio's victory over Hannibal was not just the end of the Second Punic War, it was the moment when Rome stopped being merely a regional power and began its rise as the master of the Mediterranean world. From that point forward, Roman expansion in the Iberian Peninsula became inevitable. Scipio proved that it was possible to defeat Rome's most feared enemy through intelligence and boldness. But while Scipio was fighting external enemies, another man from a completely different background was about to do something even more radical, change Rome from within by reforming the very heart of its military power, the army. That man was Gaius Marius, and what he did would transform Rome forever. Gaius Marius was not born into the Roman elite, did not have noble blood in his veins, and was never the favorite of the Senate. On the contrary, he was a man of humble origins who had to prove his worth at every step of his rise. And it was precisely this background that made him different from the other generals of his time. While the Roman aristocracy viewed military service as a privilege reserved for landowners and wealthy citizens, Marius saw something no one else wanted to see. Rome was wasting an enormous pool of human potential by excluding poor citizens who were willing to fight and die for the empire. The reform he implemented was simple in concept but revolutionary in its consequences. By opening the army to landless citizens, Marius created a force that was more professional, more disciplined, and, most importantly, more loyal, not to the Senate, but to the general who fed them, trained them, and led them into battle. This change reshaped Roman politics. When a soldier's loyalty belongs to a general rather than the state, power begins to shift in ways few people can foresee, and that many would later exploit without mercy. In campaigns against the Germanic tribes of the Teutons and the Cimbri, this reformed army proved its worth in brutal and decisive fashion. More than 100,000 enemies killed, and Marius elected consul 7 times, an absolute record in Roman history. But the most dangerous part of his legacy was not found on the battlefield. It was a seed he planted, the idea that a powerful general backed by a loyal army could aspire for far more than military victories. And it didn't take long before someone used that exact model, but with even greater ambition and a strategic brilliance few in history could match. That man was Julius Caesar, and what he did with that legacy would change the world forever. If there is one name that summarizes everything Rome represented in terms of power, ambition, and military genius, that name is Julius Caesar. Born into a patrician family of moderate prestige, Caesar was never satisfied with what his birth had given him. He wanted more, always more. His achievements in the Gallic Wars between 58 and 50 BC are still considered one of the greatest military accomplishments of the ancient world. In less than a decade, Caesar subdued peoples that Rome had never managed to dominate before, expanding the empire's borders in a way no general before him had ever achieved. The victory over Vercingetorix, the Gallic leader who managed to unite rival tribes against Rome, was the peak of this campaign, and the siege of Alesia was Caesar's masterpiece. He built 2 lines of fortifications simultaneously, one to trap Vercingetorix's army inside the city, and another to defend against a massive relief force approaching from outside. It was like fighting on 2 fronts at the same time, surrounded, with no possibility of retreat. When the battle ended, there was no doubt left. Caesar was not just a brilliant general, he was a strategist on an entirely different level. His ability to remain calm and execute complex plans under extreme pressure is something leaders in any field can learn from and apply. But Caesar was not only about war, he was also about politics, vision, and perfect timing. The crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BC was the moment he crossed a line no Roman general was supposed to cross. He entered Italian territory with his army, triggering a civil war that permanently reshaped Rome. He reformed the calendar, centralized power, and transformed the Republic into the embryo of an empire. He paid for all of this with his life, assassinated in the Roman Senate in 44 BC, but what he built did not die with him. And it was precisely on the ashes of Caesar's death that another man, his closest ally, tried to keep the flame of his legacy alive. A man as charismatic as he was dangerous, who nearly changed Rome's destiny once again. Pompey received the title Magnus, the Great, and it was not by accident. From a young age, he showed a military ability that impressed even the most experienced generals of Rome. His early campaigns in Sicily and North Africa were executed with a precision and speed that left the Roman Senate astonished. But it was during a mission that seemed almost impossible that Pompey truly showed the world what he was capable of: the elimination of piracy in the Mediterranean Sea, a problem that Rome had tried to solve for decades without success, and that was choking the empire's trade and food supply. The strategy he used was so efficient that it is still studied today as a model of large-scale military operations. Instead of chasing pirates randomly across the sea, Pompey divided the Mediterranean into multiple patrol zones, attacking simultaneously on all fronts and cutting off every possible escape route. The result was devastating for the pirates. In just 3 months, a problem that Rome had failed to solve for decades was almost completely eliminated. 3 months! It's a perfect example of how solving a massive problem often doesn't require brute force, but organization, strategy, and the courage to think differently. At the height of his power, Pompey formed the first triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Marcus Licinius Crassus, an alliance that concentrated an enormous amount of power in the hands of just 3 men. But alliances built on ambition rarely last, and this one was no different. The rivalry with Caesar gradually intensified until conflict became inevitable. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey was decisively defeated. He fled to Egypt seeking refuge, only to be assassinated shortly after arriving on shore. A tragic end for one of the greatest generals Rome ever produced. Yet while Pompey was falling, another man was rising from the ashes of that civil war, carrying Caesar's legacy in his hands and an ambition that would place him at the center of one of the most dramatic chapters in Roman history. Mark Antony was the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room, charismatic, fearless, and gifted with an oratory skill that few figures in Roman history could match. As a close ally of Julius Caesar, he became one of the main pillars of Caesarian power. And when Caesar was assassinated in the Roman Senate in 44 BC, it was Mark Antony who seized the moment with a brilliant political move. He publicly read Caesar's will, stirred the emotions of the Roman people, and turned grief into political fury against the conspirators. Few moments in ancient history were so calculated and so effective at the same time. With power suddenly up for grabs, Mark Antony formed the Second Triumvirate alongside Octavian, Augustus, and Lepidus, dividing the Roman world between 3 powerful men. But it was his alliance, both political and romantic, with Cleopatra VII that ultimately defined his fate. To many in Rome, the relationship looked like a betrayal of Roman values, a surrender to the East, a weakness disguised as love. Octavian skillfully weaponized this perception, building a powerful narrative against Antony. In many ways, Antony began losing the war of public opinion long before the armies even clashed. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC became the final turning point. Defeated both militarily and politically, with few allies left and no path to recovery, Mark Antony took his own life, and Cleopatra followed shortly after. With his death, the last major resistance to Octavian's power disappeared. And so a cycle closed. The man who had once protected Caesar's legacy became the final obstacle removed before a new, more stable Roman Empire could emerge under Augustus. Rome would never be the same again, and the generals you've seen throughout this story were the invisible architects of that transformation. Throughout this story, you've met 5 men who carried Rome on their shoulders in completely different ways, each with his own strategy, each with his own leadership style, and each paying an extremely high price for the greatness he achieved. Scipio Africanus showed that understanding your enemy can be more powerful than any weapon. Gaius Marius proved that reforming from within can be just as important as winning wars abroad. Julius Caesar demonstrated that vision without courage leads nowhere. Pompey the Great revealed that even the greatest of men can fall when politics becomes more powerful than the sword. And Mark Antony taught in the harshest way possible that narrative is power, and whoever loses control of their own story eventually loses everything. But now comes the question that really matters. What are you going to do with all of this? Because these lessons didn't stay buried in the 2nd century BC, they are still alive today, being applied by leaders, strategists, and people who understand that human nature hasn't changed much since the time of Rome. Ambition still moves the world. Loyalty still builds and destroys empires, and strategy still separates those who win from those who merely participate. Which of these 5 generals best represents the way you face your own challenges? Are you more like Scipio, turning your enemy's strength into weakness, or more like Caesar, willing to cross the Rubicon even knowing the risks? If this story awakened something in you, curiosity, admiration, or that desire to learn more, then you're in the right place. Here you'll find much more than battles and dates. You'll uncover the hidden mechanisms that drove one of the greatest civilizations in history. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this was only the first layer of a story that goes much, much deeper. Rome still holds secrets most people will never discover, but from now on, you will.